Good, so welcome. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you to Lau Taraja and others at the North London Centre for inviting me. And I'm going to be speaking about bringing the Dharma to society and politics, which is something that is close to my heart and I think is resonant and something that we all probably have some connection with. I just want to give a little dedication to this talk because it's actually my father's birthday and he died a few years ago. He came to England as a refugee from Nazi Germany as a young Jewish boy. And really throughout his life, he was trying to find ways to help people. How could he put his values and what he'd learned, what he'd seen about a society going so badly wrong into practice in terms of creating or influencing the establishment of a better society. He had his own ways, which were to do with social work, to do with psychotherapy, to do with socialism. And I've spent my life as a Buddhist, and yet there's a sort of a wish, which I partly inherited from him, partly I think I share with many other people, that what I do in my Buddhist practice benefits people, not just in terms of becoming Buddhists and being able to follow the Buddhist path for themselves, but in their immediate situations. And I think these reflections are timely, perhaps they're always timely, but we live at a time of crisis in where it's quite palpable. I'm speaking during the COVID lockdown, and that just shows us very clearly that we're dependent on so much. We can't go out of our doors without facing a threat and without that being legislated, what we can do. It shows how much we take for granted. How much we take for granted is in fact dependent upon conditions that are beyond our control. Society is malleable, it's vulnerable, and that gives us a responsibility for it. Beyond the immediate medical crisis, there is a less visible and soon to be much more prominent, I think, mental health crisis. Young people especially, so many people struggling with these conditions. And that just exacerbates long-term trends. Something is happening in our society that's causing more and more mental illness, mental distress. There's the environmental crisis, which amazingly has been moved from the top of our agenda, but certainly hasn't gone away. And there's a political crisis, which we've recently seen very dramatically unfolding in the United States. But that's, what makes it into the news expresses long-term problems in our democracies. And, what's behind that? The more you think about it, the deeper the underlying economic and cultural forces seem to go. And of course, I say of course, well, there's a spiritual crisis. I was in a meeting just recently with someone who's very senior in the world of mental health. And that was where she was talking about the mental health crisis that the NHS and so on are very aware of. Fundamentally, there's a spiritual crisis. And, for a long time, right back to the Romantics, people have argued that the environmental crisis is itself a spiritual crisis, and a lack of meaning, a desire for meaning, looking for meaning in the wrong places and the wrong ways. So I feel that, I see that, I read about it all the time in the media and on social media, but what do we do in response? So one response is to say, look, we shouldn't get involved in trying to fix society. That is actually a distraction from our own path And it's not really what the Dharma is telling us we have to contribute. Samsara is endless. You can't create utopia in samsara. So that's one point of view, which can take the form of saying, well, we should seclude ourselves in monasteries or in a separate Buddhist world. Or it can say that, you know, the cure for suffering isn't trying to fix society, it's addressing the spiritual needs and letting the material ones sort themselves out. So that's one point of view. Now, the Bodhisattva ideal is the real way that Buddhist tradition expresses an alternative point of view. But then how do you interpret the Bodhisattva ideal? So if you're unfamiliar with what I mean by that, Bodhisattva is a figure who combines wisdom and compassion. In the Buddhist myth, they're someone who defers their own enlightenment in order to be able to help all sentient beings. But that's really a mythological way of expressing a compassionate response to suffering. And particularly if you look at the Jatakas, which I've been reading recently, the stories of the Buddha's previous lives, it really sees the world not as an irrelevance to the Dharma or the spiritual life, but the world is the place in which we develop the paramitas, the perfections. It's the place in which we enact our humanity, we realize our connection with other people, and we turn from someone who is motivated by selfishness to someone who's motivated by compassion, which is Bodhisattva ideal. And you know, people who follow the Bodhisattva ideal tend to say, and I would say, that actually the Buddha was himself, although he taught the path of personal spiritual development, was very, very concerned with his society and the ills of that society. But he did it in language, I would say, that is no longer accessible for us because it's largely involved in mediating our relationship with the spirit world. So it's a pre-modern view of society that we have from the Buddha. And that's one reason why we can't really go to the Buddhist texts and find solutions to our social problems. You know, the societies are so different, very, very different. So there's another Buddhist response, which is creating an alternative society. The new society is what Sangharakshita called this. And that has traditionally, over the years, been the core of Triratna's response and is a very important contribution. And I think that's really a big part of what drew me to Triratna and has maintained my engagement with it. The sense that we're not just practicing mindfulness and meditation and all these things in a private sphere, individually or even collectively, but this has some kind of meaning for the wider world. It's a way of addressing the problems we see around us, like those crises I mentioned. But the new society, I think we have to accept, has its limitations. It hasn't grown as we hoped. And it was never really clear, at least never clear to me, how developing our own thing, our own world, our own Buddhist society, our own organization, would affect the wider society. I mean, I think actually Triratna has and does, and just teaching meditation and representing a sort of non-materialist set of values has a profound effect. But the institutions of the new society were really conceived as a realm where there was alternative to the mainstream, not a way to change mainstream culture. And I think that's because Sangharakshita felt that there was something fundamentally awry with modern culture. There was something, it lacked what he really valued, which was the vertical dimension of being, you know, the higher aspects of human experience, as he said. But for those of us who do actually want to respond to the society around us, this leaves us with an impulse to do something, but without, I think, a shared social vision in Triratna and the wider Buddhist world of what Buddhist-inspired social change might look like. And then in the absence of that shared vision, we, and I see this in my friends in the order, my contemporaries, are very drawn to other ways of helping and contributing. And these aren't, I'm going to mention some, and I'm not mentioning them as if there's something wrong with them. But I think we need to reflect on them more and understand their significance. So many, many Buddhists are involved in what you can call compassionate care, working as therapists, as in healthcare, social workers. And this is, I think, very valuable. We need to recognize this. But how does it tie up with a social vision that comes from the Dharma? And then there's activism. You know, I've got many friends who are activists, particularly on environmental causes, and others who are engaged with mainstream politics. This is where it starts to get trickier, I think. And I see more and more political engagement and sort of political concern and discussion in order contexts, for example. And I wonder about that a bit. What I really wonder about is the assumptions. So most of us assume that our own, if we're Buddhists and we have political views, that our views are the necessary Buddhist ones. And then we're rather shocked when we discover that there are different ways of applying Buddhism to social issues. And, you know, issues that have been very prominent, like Brexit, you know, there are different views in the order and among Buddhists. And Black Lives Matter, you know, there's quite a debate about how we should respond to that. Even climate change, which rather surprised me, but there was a group of climate change skeptics among my Buddhist friends. So, you know, I have some of my own assumptions are coming out now, aren't they? My biases. Most Buddhists tend to be on the left politically, but not all. And I think we need to mention the fact that Her Majesty's Attorney General is a Mitra, a Triratna Mitra, and is a wholehearted supporter of our government, which is, of course, notably right-wing. So we can't assume what it means to make a Buddhist response to political issues, and yet we do. And I think the reason is that political involvement assumes or implies a way of interpreting society, a whole superstructure of steps between the basic Dharma and how we think we should respond to economics or inequality or poverty or any of these things. So in each of those steps, we make an interpretation. And there are some very well developed Buddhist political stances. David Loy is a very interesting writer on this sort of subject. My good friend Vardika wrote a book called Buddha on Wall Street, and there are many other people who are really thinking in their ways about what Buddhism means for society. But there are other people who are thinking in other ways. There are right-wing Buddhists, and there are Republicans and conservative Buddhists. And can we really say that there shouldn't be, those of us who are more politically on the left? Well, that would be a tremendous limitation if we did say that. And what really is going on with these interpretive steps between basic Dharma principles and a political philosophy or a political platform? You know, the Buddha warned us about this. He warned of the danger of being drawn into a thicket or a net of speculative views, where debates are endless, and it's impossible really to distinguish an objective truth from our own preferences, our own biases. So now I've reflected on this over the years, and rather than giving up, I've kept on thinking, well, what is a Buddhist social agenda that doesn't divide us and that is soundly based in the Dharma? Is it just teaching people meditation and ethics and wisdom, or is there something more? And I've come to feel over the years that there is, and that's really what I want to share with you. So one of the things that's prompted this is doing Thought for the Day. Now, so as you probably know, this is a comment on the news from a Buddhist perspective on the main radio news program in the morning, and a lot of people listen to it. British establishment famously always listen to the Today program, of which it's a part. And it's more constrained than you might think. There are lots of rules about what you can and can't say. So my brief, I do this about 10 times a year, but I've been doing it since 2006. So that's nearly 15 years. That's a lot of talks. It's basically a job for life, I think. And I do other talks like that in other contexts, actually. So how can you say something meaningful without buying into at some point on a political spectrum? The answer is you have to go from the particular issue to something more general, but you have to do that in a way that isn't platitudinous, or at least you have to try. So this has been a discipline for me, not just, I'm not allowed to just give my own political views. It has to be something more considered than that. And another area where I've learned something about this is in advocating mindfulness. As I became a mindfulness teacher about 12 years ago, so I've been involved in that world, and mindfulness has attracted political attention. We've worked with various groups advocating as an advocate. In Westminster, also in Cardiff, and advocating what mindfulness practice can contribute to society. And of course, we have to do this on a cross-party basis. And again, not tie into a political narrative of one sort or another. So I'm going to name 6 themes where I think the Dharma has something to say directly to society that doesn't involve a big process of interpreting society. I'm not saying this is the end of the story. This isn't a political platform. But the principle is really restricting the scope of where we put our energy and our efforts, or where I do anyway. To the things that I know about as a Buddhist. There's a term in some of the Buddhist scriptures, gochara, which means pasture, which really means mind your own business, or attend to the things that are your concern. Don't get involved in other people's concerns. Gochara. And there's also a principle of parsimony, which is something philosophers sometimes talk about, which means not making claims beyond what you actually know. So let me give you the 6 themes, and some of these are already happening. So I'm going to start with the centrality of the mind, and that's clearly one of the real concerns of Buddhism, and it's become increasingly resonant in our society. I mean, it's resonant for us individually when we realize or continue to realize how much of our experience isn't about stuff going on out there. It's about what I bring to it, how my well-being and happiness is to some extent within my active control in terms of how I think and feel and orient my mind. And this is increasingly resonant. And the vehicle through which it has become resonant is primarily this movement of mindfulness practice. So recently shown some research that 15% of the population have learned mindfulness, fairly thoroughly, and have, and some proportion of that actively continue it. 15%, 35% of the population know about mindfulness, a further 35% know about mindfulness, have a favorable view of it, and are interested in trying it out. That, I think, is very significant for how Buddhism is situated in our society. It's not entirely a good thing because mindfulness is secularized, it's universalized, it's stripped of a lot of the ritual and the myth and all the rest of it, which I and many of my Buddhist friends love so much and actually think is addressing the sort of starvation of the soul that's also a problem in our society. But mindfulness does have that to some extent, and that feeling, that resonance is part of its appeal. We just don't really know how to connect it with any more explicit versions of that without compromising the secularity. But it's becoming very important in a lot of fields. There are agendas around well-being, mental health, and education. And so well-being and mental health in education is a very big field now. And this is what I talk about, explore, advocate with the Westminster Parliament through the Mindfulness Initiative and the Welsh Government, where we have quite a strong collaboration. And there's an awful lot happening. I mean, you would not believe it. The whole of the, and this is not necessarily my doing or my friends doing, but the whole of the Welsh education curriculum has been completely recast with well-being and health as one of the core elements, and ideas about emotional development, emotional intelligence, and development of emotional intelligence being at the core of that. So that gives the schools the challenge of fostering the emotional intelligence of their students for their own well-being and as an educational goal. And that's very difficult. I mean, we also work with head teachers and other people and implementing this in schools. How do you do that? They don't know. That's not their expertise. So mindfulness comes as a contribution to that. I mean, it's not the whole story by any means. So, yeah, mindfulness practices come in as therapeutic interventions, but beyond that, the notion of well-being and inner development is a core goal. And mindfulness is also seen some times as a foundational faculty, something that we really need in this age of information overload and the attention economy. We need to cultivate our attention just to really get by. But then other values are implicit in mindfulness, especially compassion. I'm going to come on to that in a bit. Yeah, so the practice, mindfulness is not the same as meditation. It's a whole way of being, but both as a practice in general for the whole of life and as a sitting practice, it points towards a distinctive set of values, ways to live, and ways to run organizations, to engage in healthcare and education, and so on. And so there's tremendous interest in this. I'm not claiming that this interest is realized or even realizable But we're having the conversation, and that, let me tell you, as someone who's been doing this sort of thing for many years, is a huge change, and the interest is growing and growing. So where is this taking form, or in what other ways is this taking form? And along with the mindfulness agenda, you know, that value that's taken from Buddhism and applied in so many ways, there's compassion agenda. The caring professions have carried that, really. And so mindfulness, sorry, karuna, compassionate care, that's the second of my themes. This is a very important part of society, and many Buddhists work in these fields. And I think really the question here is, what do we have to contribute? You know, what is it that makes a Buddhist social worker or a Buddhist nurse or doctor different? Or what is it that their Dharma can bring to augment their practice? I think this is very, very important. We need to really value what so many people in our Sanghas do and see that as a Dharma practice. But we also need to really start to reflect, what is it for it to be an effective Dharma practice? There's a broader point that I want to bring out, which is that Buddhism values human experience for what it is, non-instrumentally. I find it quite hard to express this sort of simply and clearly, but an instrumental approach means that I value you, nurse, for the outcomes that you achieve, the work you do, and the health benefits that brings. So that's an instrumental approach. A non-instrumental approach is one that values the qualities of human connection and care and things that can't be so easily measured for themselves. So the means is the end, if you see what I mean. And this is quite a big area of discussion for some of us about non-instrumental approaches to organizations. It's at odds with a target-driven approach, a profit-driven approach. At least in practice, it tends to be at odds with those things. And I think there's the seed in that of an alternative approach to government per se. So my third theme, after karuna, is metta, loving kindness. And this follows on from what I've just been saying. But where does it become real? You know, a loving attitude and recognition of the power of its opposite in our societies, that should shape our attitude to conflicts, to wars. Now, Buddhism isn't pacifist, but this orientation means that there's a strong alignment between the Dharma and the cause of peace. And Sangha actually gave quite an interesting talk many years ago now called Buddhism, World Peace and Nuclear War, which is one of the places he does, few places I'd say really, where he does engage with the issues of the day. Because, you know, nuclear war was what a lot of us were talking about in those days in the way that we now talk about the environment. Metta is universal, and it encourages us to regard people kindly, regardless of their identities. And that aligns Buddhism with anti-racist, internationalist outlooks. It aligns us with a lot of the liberal causes that want to see people of different sexual orientations, different genders, and, you know, the spectrum of gender identification as with the same way. It's not to say everyone's the same, but metta is an attitude that equally embraces the humanity of everyone. So it aligns us with the cause of diversity. I think that is right. Now, some of my Buddhist friends are, having said Buddhism is internationalist, well, what about nationalism? I mean, there are some of my Buddhist friends are very involved with Scottish nationalism at the moment. In fact, I gave a previous version of this talk at the Glasgow Buddhist Centre, where, you know, there are a lot of people very, very involved in SNP, the SNP, and so on and so forth. And, you know, I think there, it's really about distinguishing between nationalism as a way to create an inclusive national community where everyone is accepted, and being clear that the sort of chauvinistic, prejudiced version of nationalism is not what we're concerned about. That's a contrary. There's so many things I could talk about, and so little time. But the next of my themes after the mind, metta, karana, metta, is conditionality or karma. And I think this is really where the resonance with the environment comes. In Wales, where I live, we have a piece of legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act 2015, which states that every action of the Welsh government needs to take into account a range of criteria, which include, for example, having a long-term perspective, meaning a long-term perspective of its environment, the environmental impacts, but also the social impacts. So the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, the well-being of future generations. And it really is a fantastic piece of legislation. It's such a radical alternative to short-term pressures and shareholder value and all this sort of thing. Implementing it is not straightforward. I mean, people, including the people who work in the Welsh government, really need to shift their mindset. And so there are mindfulness-based approaches to help them do that. Then it's the conditionality has affinities with science, because scientific method is developed with the aim of correcting against a subjective bias. So Buddhists should be guided by the evidence. This is something else I've learned through my mindfulness advocacy. We have to be evidence-based. Now, this is not straightforward, and I probably don't have time to really go into it. It doesn't mean naively accepting scientific orthodoxy, but we see a crisis in this area. I mean, for example, around vaccine skepticism, but also around the proliferation of conspiracy theories, which we've seen in relation to Trump, etc. And I think we need to notice the association of many people in the New Age and holistic health worlds with those sorts of conspiracy theories. And there's an underlying view here, which is that science is mechanistic, reductive, and has produced a form of medicine, and this is where I actually agree, which treats illness as a matter of the body and in a way that's entirely divorced from the mind. And with no sense of what the soul or the spirit might mean. And this produces a very reductive, narrow view of the patient. And many people, many of my friends in the worlds of holistic health and alternative therapies, and then beyond that in the environmental movement and New Age world, reject science and the scientific, and there's a belief underlying a lot of that the soul or the spirit is autonomous and free and is the source of our power. It's the sort, it can, in some of these versions, it's the thing that can renew our lives. It can touch a source of energy which is capable of empowering us over cancer and our career prospects and everything in between. And it is actually quite dangerous. that view, because it's so divorced from a basis in evidence. And we see this proliferating through the empowering agency of the internet. And we really need to come back to the Buddhist idea of conditionality and tracing causes and conditions in a way that makes sense and you can demonstrate. Now, the next one is contentment or anti-materialism. I'm going to be a bit briefer about this because of time. And, but this is the most pressing contribution that we can make in a consumerist society in ecological crisis. Buddhism understands that human flourishing and well-being doesn't depend on stuff, doesn't depend on consumption, entertainment, or even pleasure. Independence upon craving arises suffering, yes? So, and we can keep on coming back to that, this principle to orient ourselves. Buddhist teachings and practices foster this attitude directly, but the non-instrumentality principle, I think, is a way of connecting you with what I was saying about public services and so on. And then just I want to bring in Sangharakshita here and there in this talk. I think his distinctive contribution was championing this, what he calls the vertical dimension of experience, something that is, we really, in some ways, lost a way of talking about accessing and describing and valuing in our society. But all of the values that you can't weigh and measure, that's the vertical dimension. So, I think as Buddhists, we need to keep that alive in our own lives and in our sanghas, this sense of enacting something more. And that is our contribution. Finally, the last theme is skillful communication. I actually talk about this quite a lot on Thought for the Day. And I think about it very often if I look at my Facebook feed with some of my very political Buddhist friends who are annoyed by the latest reactionary acts of our government and express it very fully and do that in a way that really is reflecting the way that most people talk about politics. That is my point of view in a sense, and I've given up lecturing people because about the speech precepts, but I am surprised by what I see. And I think more widely, we should accept that our democracies are in crisis because of the extent of polarization, our decreasing capacity as a society to listen to each other, which is widely discussed in the media. And we need to be part of the solution to that and not part of the problem. And that, I think, is another yardstick for how we engage with society and politics. Am I part of that problem? And that means sticking to the speech precepts in our role as citizens, as well as in our personal life. So just to sum up, these are my 6 themes. Centrality of the mind, karuna, or compassionate care, metta, conditionality, what are my 6 themes? The skillful communication, and I think I've forgotten one. Anyway, this is what we have to contribute to society. No one, and this has become quite clear to me, say, doing Thought for the Day, no one cares what I think about Brexit. I've got my views, you can probably guess what they are. No one cares about them. I have nothing distinctive or particular to say about whether the UK should be part of the European Union. There isn't a Buddhist view on that. actually. There is a Buddhist view about how we operate as a society, about how we talk about issues like Brexit. And when and I find that people do want to hear that. They do want to hear the distinctive things that we contribute. So, yes, I've talked about where we can identify that, how we can avoid getting drawn into political agendas based on a superstructure of non-Buddhist views. And thereby, when we do that, importing society's disputes into our Buddhist sanghas. Instead, I think we need to identify what it is that we have in common as Buddhists. Now, you may disagree with the particular links that I've made between the Dharma and our society. Mindfulness movement, for example, is quite controversial. Not everyone thinks it's a good thing at all. And that's fine. Disagree on the particulars. Let's explore that together. I'm offering this as a stimulus for reflection and discussion, not a definitive answer. But I firmly believe that what we have to offer most is that which is most firmly based in the Dharma. Thank you.